Every monster has its weaknesses. The vampire has a lot. Let's talk about your vampire project. The vampire is one of those rare creatures where you could walk up to just about anybody and ask them, what kills a vampire? And they would probably give you an answer. They might list off sunlight or garlic or stake through the heart or cross or anything like that. And that's really rather spectacular. In every single vampire movie, there's a character who explains what the vampire's actual weaknesses are and what weaknesses are just superstition and don't actually work. So let's go through a list of all the vampire weaknesses and figure out which ones are right for your vampire and which ones your hunter got wrong, leading to a very bad day. The first and most obvious one is sunlight. And this one leads to some spectacular death scenes. Whether we're talking about John Carpenter's vampires or we're talking about Near Dark, there's something that's just so instantly satisfying about seeing the sun come bursting in through those windows and hitting the vampire and making them burst into flames. Even down to the Hammer Films version of Dracula, or what we in the States here got as Horror of Dracula. The first one with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing together as Dracula and Van Helsing, where Van Helsing pulls the curtains down from the window and sunlight streams in and hits Dracula. And even though they did not have the technology at the time to put pyrotechnics all over Christopher Lee, they still figured out a way to do a really satisfying vampire death with the special effects that they had access to. But sunlight is an important choice one way or the other. And the reason for that is this. Sunlight is a very recent weakness for vampires. In fact, it's only 100 years old. In literature, sunlight didn't hurt vampires. Even in Dracula could walk around in the sun. His powers were somewhat limited. And if we go backwards into Carmilla wasn't destroyed by the sunlight either. She didn't seem to like it, but she wasn't necessarily hurt by it. Going back farther to The Mysterious Guest, Sir Azo never appeared in the sun. He only appeared whenever the sun went down, but there was never anything explicitly saying that he couldn't go out in the day. And then, of course, going back to Polidori's The Vampire, Lord Ruthven was able to go out in daylight or at night, whichever. In Varney the Vampire, he was able to heal from the moonlight hitting his body, the same as Ruthven, but there wasn't anything that the sun necessarily did to hurt him. The sun became deadly to vampires with the very first vampire movie, or at least the first that we have access to. And that is F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, which came out in 1922, the black and white silent horror film. In this one, which is an adaptation of Dracula, in this one, Murnau decided that he wanted a spectacular vampire death at the end, and so he had Count Orlok being destroyed by the first rays of dawn. And that was the very first time that a vampire was ever destroyed by sunlight. But the movie for the time period was so good and so engaging that it just instantly became part of vampire fiction from that point onward. And as I said earlier, when Hammer Films got around to doing Dracula in the 50s, they chose to go with Nosferatu's sunlight as a weapon, even though they were adapting Dracula, the book. So sunlight, you can legitimately go either way with. The next most obvious one is the stake through the heart. So this, you would see in just about any Dracula movie. You would see in almost any vampire movie or television show at all. I mean, certainly that's how Buffy destroyed vampires. In The Lost Boys, the vampire deaths were spectacular from being staked through the heart, including death by stereo, of course. But the stake through the heart is something that goes back to folklore, so it is very strongly rooted in the origins of the vampire, in that when someone was buried who was suspected of possibly rising as a vampire, the people who were burying them would go to extra lengths to try and keep them in the coffin after they were finished interring them. So this could take the form of sickles over the throat. It could take the form of a large stone being put in the jaws of the vampire. It could have to do with the body being dismembered and rearranged. The body turned upside down, so it was facing down. So if it did try to claw out, it would just claw downward forever. But the easiest and probably most common way was to drive some sort of a nail or a stake through the vampire, sometimes in multiple different places. And that was meant to hold them in their coffin so that they couldn't affect the living by rising and leaving. So this then was kind of taken by Stoker and turned into an actual means of killing a vampire who is above their grave. And that has remained the case for ever since Dracula. Now, there is one alteration on the stake through the heart that I feel like maybe I should mention just because it's kind of a favorite of mine. And that is that in the White Wolf games, Vampire the Masquerade, they had a mechanic in this game for staking through the heart where a stake through the heart wouldn't actually kill the vampire, but it would in fact paralyze them. And that didn't matter if they were in their coffin or if they were standing up or if they were in the middle of battle. If you drove a stake through the vampire's heart, they would immediately be paralyzed and collapsed, unable to move. And I like that, just because it gives you a way not only to subdue a vampire in a way to where you can continue the story without the vampire having to be dead, and it also gives you a way of defeating a vampire without actually killing them. And I mean, I understand, Christopher Lee came back as Dracula like 6 or 7 times. Like, killing Dracula doesn't necessarily mean anything. There's always something that can bring him back from the dead. And vampires are just like that. But if you're establishing rules for strengths and weaknesses, it's nice to have one that can completely incapacitate the vampire, allowing either villains or heroes to capture them, take them back to a place where they can be interrogated, have a moment of peace to explain what their plans are, etc. It's good for a moment of, oh, we think the vampire has defeated, or we think the heroes have won, and then as soon as that stake comes out, it's back on again. So, just something to bear in mind. Beheading, or severing the spinal column, either one. This also, I mean, this is fairly ubiquitous as well in most vampire fiction. Probably because beheading anything kind of feels like that thing is dead. It's a pretty final wound to give to somebody. You can find this in Dracula. You can also find it in the Vampire Chronicles. You can find it in Twilight. You can find it in Blade. It is a very visual way to kill a vampire or defeat an enemy or feel like there's some finality of like this one is not coming back. There is an excellent effect in the Subspecies movies. It's in Subspecies 2, the very beginning of the film. I hope I'm not spoiling this at all to tell you that the villain from the first movie comes back in the second movie. And in the beginning of the second movie, we start with the villain Radu beheaded, laying on the floor of a castle. And his little sort of familiar minions, the Subspecies, or these little sort of impish demon-like characters that drag his head back over to his body, and then these tendrils shoot out of his head into his neck and pull his head back together with his body. And a friend of mine actually did these special effects. I found out much later, at which point he became sort of like a minor hero of mine. But that is a very, very cool, like, visual way, almost kind of John Carpenter's The Thing-esque way of showing that even beheading is not necessarily forever if the proper conditions are met. Silver. This is a slightly more mercurial weakness for vampires because it's one that we associate with werewolves. And so, depending on what generation you come from, you may feel like, well, silver kind of belongs with werewolves, and I don't want any werewolves in my vampires. And that is totally fair. The one thing that I would say, because silver has been used to great effect in True Blood, it's been used in Blade, it's been used in Helsing. All of these are, to some extent, well warranted in that there was very little difference in Eastern Europe between a vampire and a werewolf. And a lot of times those two were seen as the same thing, or sort of like mutations of the same evil creature. Now, silver was not part of Eastern European folklore for killing werewolves, but I don't think there's a problem with using silver as a means to harm your vampire. In fact, it was used to great effect in Dracula 2000 with Gerard Butler as Dracula. I won't tell you why exactly because it does spoil the film, but that's one that is definitely worth checking out. Garlic. This one actually maybe should have come before silver, but garlic is not. Garlic is more of a vampire repellent, it feels like, rather than an actual weapon. Your mileage may vary. Feel free to argue with me about that one. That's what the comment section is for, after all. But garlic goes back to Dracula for repelling vampires. It's definitely one of those sort of folk remedies for evil creatures and, use against witches and stuff like that. It's used to excellent effect, obviously, in Blade, where Blade uses essence of garlic. When in Dracula, when they kill Lucy after she's turned into a vampire, they behead her and then they fill her mouth with garlic and then reseal her tomb. This harkens back to the idea of like putting a stone in the vampire's mouth when you bury it. But it is a kind of a spectacular visual. And there was a great moment in the NBC series of Dracula where you suddenly see a head with its mouth stuffed full of garlic of a former suspected vampire, and that's really powerful stuff. It's a wonderful little way to not only provide some comic relief with people dealing with garlic, just in a normal everyday kind of setting, but also as a nice little deterrent that allows you to kind of almost sort of sterilize an area if you need to keep your vampire out for plot reasons. The crucifix, holy water, the Eucharist, the Bible, the exorcist's handbook, all of these things can cause damage to a vampire, hurt a vampire, reciting prayers to a vampire can harm it. You don't see this as much anymore. When it's done, recently anyway, when it's done, it's usually done in a nostalgic kind of fashion, harkening back to vampire stories of old. But the fact of the matter is that we're living in a far more enlightened, scientific, secular world now than we were back during the 1800s, when writers were writing their vampire stories back at that time. So it seems to a large portion of the readership now just a little more naive or a little more far-fetched for a vampire to be harmed by holy water or a crucifix. Not because the religion of the writer is wrong, but because it just begs the question in a lot of people's minds of, well, wait a minute, why? Why the crucifix as opposed to like the sign of Islam? As opposed to the Star of David, as opposed to burning Shinto incense, any of those things. It just, all it is it's what we refer to in the movie business as a bump, where you hit a part of the script where you're like, wait a minute. And then suddenly you've missed the next couple of lines of dialogue because your brain was stuck on the thing that it was stuck on. So just something to consider. It's certainly religious artifacts and iconography harming a vampire have certainly been used very well in all sorts of recent media, whether it be John Carpenter's Vampires of Buffy, of course, Vampire Hunter D. Any of these things perfectly fine, and they work perfectly fine. It's just a matter of getting it in there in a way that isn't going to make half the audience go, wait a minute. We'll be doing an entire episode on this, by the way, and really digging into it. Needing to sleep in the earth of their homeland, or being able to sleep in their coffin, or back in their grave at night. This one you actually don't see all that often anymore either, because it makes it tough for your vampire to be a globe-trotting, dark and sexy, brooding creature of adventure and of schemes and plans and plots, if they are limited by the number of miles they can travel away from the place where they were originally buried. It also, in these days of vampire romance, makes it a little rough to have the sexy times in a bed when the vampire has to sleep in the dirt. So this one gets left out quite a bit these days. However, there is ample room in there for some interesting stuff to do. And there has certainly been very interesting stuff done with this. Not the least of which, I know we keep talking about Dracula, but I mean, that is kind of the elephant in the room. And where we get so many of our weaknesses and strengths for vampires from. But Dracula, in order to move to London from Transylvania, had to send boxes of dirt from the basement of his castle in order to be able to sleep somewhere during the day to regain his powers. So that's an example of that being a very clear-cut weakness for the vampire, and the vampire outsmarting that weakness, being ingenuitive and coming up with a way to circumvent the things that they can't do in order to do the things that they want to do. Another couple just interesting ways that that's been used is that for traveling purposes, Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, the author of the Saint Germain vampire series, who has been writing vampire fiction for a very long time, by the way, her main character, her main vampire, the Count Saint Germain, is able to get around this issue by wearing shoes that have a reservoir in the sole that holds the dirt from his homeland. And that's very clever. That's a very clever workaround. But also having a grave that the vampire needs to return to is a good way to put some jeopardy in the vampire's daylight hours, because that's a place where they have to go, where if the vampire hunters can find it, know they will catch the vampire there during the vampire's weakest time. This has been used countless times, but in the story of Carmilla, she, as a vampire, was also very clever in the fact that she had to return to her grave every night, which was a tomb in a very old graveyard of her family's. But she was smart enough to stay one step ahead of the hunters and move the headstones so that when they found the headstone for Carmilla Karnstein's grave and they started digging, they didn't find her because she had essentially moved her grave. That's clever stuff. That's a smart vampire. And that's the kind of stuff that will make your readers go, oh my, what? That was so smart. I totally sounded like an old person when I said that. Fire. This can be found all over the place, from the Vampire Chronicles to Blade to Dracula. And it goes all the way back to folklore, when if a town or community was beset by a vampire, they would exhume the vampire's body if they could find it from the ground, and then they would take out the heart, burn the heart, and then burn the body, or put the body back after burning the heart. And so fire has, for a very long time, been seen as a means by which the vampire can be destroyed. And in Vampire the Masquerade, the role-playing game, fire was one of the key ways to kill a vampire. In fact, it was the fastest, most direct way to destroy a vampire. On the flip side of that, if you look at the Hammer films, there was the Carmilla or the Karnstein trilogy that dealt with Carmilla. And the second movie of which was called Lust for a Vampire, in which there's a scene where the heroes are trying to burn down the castle with the satanic shrine in it that that Carmilla and her vampire family were trying to conduct their nefarious plans in. And the whole place is on fire, and they're standing there, the vampires are standing there, and Count Karnstein, or whomever the villainous male vampire is, just looks around and says, "Fire? There is no death for us in fire." And I like that. Not because the vampire is immune to fire, but because that suggests that not all vampires are the same, and that whatever weapons you're coming at them with might work for the vampires you killed before, but not necessarily for the ones you're facing now. Invitation to enter a home. This is a fabulous weakness. I don't know where this actually comes from. I suspect it goes back into folklore, where evil spirits would need an invitation to come into the house. It's a very fun, very vampire weakness, and a lot of people are familiar with this one, so it's a good one to use because it's an immediate touchstone. The vampire that is outside asking to be let in, whether it be in Salem's Lot or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or mistakenly inviting a vampire into the home because somebody in the home doesn't believe in vampires, like in Fright Night, where the mom invites Jerry Dandridge in, and then suddenly everyone's in danger. You've also got, this idea has since been expanded upon in recent years, like in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where Buffy eventually invited Spike into her home during a particular season, and because they were working as allies. And then at a certain point later on, she rescinded her invitation just by saying, "I rescind my invitation." And suddenly, Spike had to leave. He was forced by supernatural powers, by divine edict or something, to get the hell out of Buffy's house. This then got used a couple times in True Blood, and that's a real interesting sort of development on the idea. But then you've also got other options with this, where a vampire does not necessarily, it's not necessarily impossible for them to enter the home. Like, for example, in Let the Right One In, where the vampire character is waiting in the hallway and is asking the young protagonist to let her in. And he says, what happens to you if I don't give you my invitation? And she shows him by stepping into his house, and then she immediately starts to fall apart, like she's in pain, and she's starting to bleed, and all of this stuff that's going wrong with her all of a sudden, like this adverse allergic reaction. And that's really cool stuff right there. And so then he immediately invites her, and then suddenly she's able to, she kind of heals back up again. But you've also got instances like in The Lost Boys, where vampires can enter somebody's house, but if they enter without an invitation, that means that they are vulnerable to attacks by the people in the house. The vampire can be killed in the house. But if the vampire is invited into the house, then all the things like garlic and mirrors and all of these things suddenly won't work on the vampire. The vampire will appear to be human, and you will be powerless against him. So there are ways to take these weaknesses and just sort of tweak them to your needs in order to make your plot work the way you want it to. And that's a good example of that. Then we've got, so those are all of the, the big ones. There are also a lot of sort of secondary, very obscure weaknesses for vampires that have just been used a little bit here, a little bit there. But they're worth going through because some of them are really kind of interesting and weird. And there's nothing wrong with having one or two weird ones in your story. The first one that comes to mind is iron. Iron is something that recently in role-playing games and recent urban fantasy literature, iron tends to only affect fairies, or that is what affects fairies. Now I am remembering cold iron having an effect on vampires in something. But when I went through all of my notes, I could not find what that thing was. So if you happen to know what it was, tell me in the comments, because I'm dying to remember what this was. Running water. This is something that I guess kind of technically is in Dracula, because there's danger of Dracula's coffin as it's on a raft being rowed upriver back to his castle. If the raft capsizes and the coffin goes into the river and submerges, then he'll be dead forever. But running water was also, I think, just seen as a repellent for supernatural creatures in ancient folklore. There's a whole werewolf myth about werewolves not being able to cross running water. And I believe that went to witches at some point and to vampires at some point. But I think that got evolved into, not only can they not cross it, if they're submerged in it, it will destroy them. And this is used in the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. It was used in the Blood Rain video games as a means to keep you from jumping in the water. It would immediately cause damage. That was then used in the movies for reasons that's not even worth talking about. Hawthorn. So Hawthorn this falls into the category of like natural folk remedies for problems. And there's some association with hawthorn as perhaps having been the branches that were used to make the crown of thorns that were placed on Jesus's head on the day of his crucifixion. So that is harmful to vampires. But that is also has been seen for a very long time as hawthorn just being harmful to witches and supernatural creatures. I think the association to Jesus's crown sort of came later, but regardless, it still kind of stands that hawthorn is a wood that is extremely harmful to vampires, even in its natural, just growing state. And it was used to somewhat exciting effect in the final movie that Christopher Lee did as Dracula, which was The Satanic Rites of Dracula. And in that movie, Dracula is, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling a movie from, 45, 50 years ago, but Dracula is killed in this movie by accidentally walking through a hawthorn bush. Yeah, hawthorn. Who knew? The mountain rose. This is used in Dracula. There's mention in Dracula of if you place a rose on a vampire's coffin while they're inside of it, they can't get out. That was then evolved in Fright Night 2 as the rose was used to kill one of the vampires by stuffing an entire rose bulb into the vampire's mouth, killed them. So your mileage may vary with roses. Holy ground. It stands to reason if a vampire can't look at a cross or is burned by holy water, they certainly can't enter a church or any consecrated place like that. The Vatican would be very safe. But there was an interesting sort of twist in the original Subspecies movie where Stephan, who was not that Stephan, a different Stephan, they actually look kind of similar. Anyway, the good vampire, Stephan, wanted to enter a church, and he was invited, and then he was able to enter, and he didn't burn up or anything like that. But his brother Radu was not invited, and in theory could not enter the church. Seeds. This is part of folklore. Vampires had a predilection for they needed to count things if they came across them. It was knots in a fishing net or in a long piece of rope or string or seeds. They couldn't concentrate. It was like they had OCD. They couldn't concentrate until they knew the number of seeds or knots that were there. And so a lot of times when a suspected vampire was buried, it would be buried along with pouring seeds in the coffin, with the idea that the vampire had to count the seeds before they would be able to leave the coffin, and that would take them a lot of time. I mean, when you think about it, maybe it would only take about a half hour, but that's an extra half hour the village would have to. You get what I'm saying? That's the secret reason why on Sesame Street, Count Von Count loves to count. It blew my mind when I found that out. This was actually also used in an X-Files episode where Mulder was able to use that obscure knowledge to stop a vampire from attacking him by throwing a bunch of seeds on the ground, and the vampire just rolled his eyes and got down and started counting them. Very funny moment. It was a hilarious moment for people who like vampire jokes, and anyone else in the room was just like, I don't get it. Stealing the burial shroud. I like this one a lot because it's sort of a mutation of the vampire needs to sleep in the earth of their grave or their homeland, where the vampire needs to sleep with their shroud. It's cool because it suddenly makes the vampire's ability to move great distances possible while still manacling them to something that they were buried with. So, like, they can move on to a new town as long as they bring their shroud with them. And then, assumedly, they leave their shroud in the place where they sleep during the day. But that also makes for an excellent target for vampire hunters. And in the first of the Hammer movies, Karnstein trilogy about Carmilla, there's a scene where, in the very beginning of The Vampire Lovers, where there's a character who is recounting the tale or a time when they had to kill a vampire and did it by stealing the vampire's shroud while the vampire was out drinking the blood of their victim. And this made for a very cool image when the vampire comes back to their grave site and they're looking around for their shroud and they can't find it, and then they realize that it's nearby and somebody has it, and then they go to get that person. That's good stuff. A blessed bullet. So this comes from a particular gypsy profession of vampire hunter. They were men who were suspected of being half vampire, or their father was a vampire. And so they were able to sell themselves as vampire hunters, trackers. When there was a vampire problem in a village, they were able to go and figure out what grave it was so that the village could do something about it. And one of the ways of killing a vampire for one of these Dhampir vampire hunters was to fire a blessed bullet into the grave, and that would kill the vampire and take care of the problem. Now, I suspect that this particular remedy for vampire problems came about from vampire hunters who were tired of digging up dead bodies. And they really just kind of wanted a solution that didn't require them to spend all day getting dirty and picking up dead people. And so suddenly you could just bless a bullet, fire it into the grave, and you were fine. So does this get used modern day at all? Yeah, actually. In Helsing, Alucard has a gun that is filled with bullets that are silver, but are also blessed, and that's why they do so much damage. So it's still, depending on how you use it, can be very cool. There's also hawthorn buckshot from a shotgun. There was even a scene in Subspecies where a particular vampire hunter loaded up a shotgun with shells that were filled with rosary beads. That's badass. Then we get into some very specific ones tied to specific intellectual properties. So, for example, in Vampire the Masquerade, this is a role-playing game, so there's so much that is based on variable statistics for characters and different combat scenarios and stuff like that. So on the list of vampire weaknesses were the claws and fangs of a werewolf. There was a completely separate game called Werewolf the Apocalypse, which dovetailed with Vampire the Masquerade, and one group who was playing werewolf could moved their campaign and merged their campaign with another group that was playing vampire. And without a whole lot of trouble, suddenly you had this rivalry between these two groups that you could play out. And so that's an instance where you're taking another supernatural entity and saying there is animosity between vampires and this other creature, and there are some stakes to this. Pardon the pun. These creatures can harm vampires with just their natural weapons. So that means that this is not a threat to take lightly. And I like that. In the Vampire Chronicles, Anne Rice introduced the idea of dead blood poisoning a vampire. So, and this is good. It goes with the whole mythology of drinking blood, which is the basis of vampires in the first place. They need to drink the blood of the living. So it makes sense that if they drink the blood of the dead, somebody who's no longer living, that would hurt them. And so that is actually used as a poison in order to try and assassinate one of the vampires in the Vampire Chronicles. I will leave it at that, because if you haven't read the Vampire Chronicles, you really should. I don't want to spoil anything for you. And then we come to my favorite obscure vampire weakness. So this comes from a particular writer back in the 1800s named Paul Faval. He was a French guy. And this is during the period where vampires were just the Wild West. There was like a lot of people were writing about vampires, and they could do just about anything. And he wrote about a city of the vampires that was in a hidden location somewhere in Eastern Europe. And there were very specific like rituals that you had to go through to even get into the city and to even find it. And once you were there, that city was filled with vampires, the city of Selene. And the only defense you had against them was by capturing a vampire, burning that vampire down to ash, and then that ash could be used to defend yourself against other vampires in the city, which at a particular time, the bells would ring in the city and all the vampires would come out of their homes, and if they found you, they would kill you. So you would have to run as fast as you could as soon as you heard the bells ringing, and as the vampires were nipping at your heels, you could use this ash and throw it, and any vampire who is hit with the ash of a burned vampire would fucking explode. What? That is crazy pants. I love that. So that is an entire buffet of vampire weaknesses. And like a buffet, you get to choose which ones you want your vampire to have. Now, you could choose one, you could choose three, you could choose all of them, or you could also make up your own. And please don't be afraid to do that, because it's always nice to add a little something new to the genre and to surprise us. The strengths of a vampire are what make them enticing and dangerous, but their weaknesses define them as a character, and they allow for us to have a connection with them. Essentially, they're fears by pathos from us, the audience. A vampire hero who has weaknesses gets us on their side. A vampire villain with weaknesses who figures out a way to work around them makes them a formidable villain indeed. Tell us about your vampire weaknesses. We would love to know. You can put that down in the comments, or you can hashtag it YVP on social media so that we can easily find it out there. Next time, we're going to be talking about how vampires reproduce, how to create a new vampire, how to baptize a new vampire. So that's what we'll be going over on the next Your Vampire Project. Your Vampire Dollars. I want to recommend this comic book series. It's called Silver, and it's written, created, and illustrated by a guy named Stephan Franck. And Stephan, I just saw his credit appear as the animation supervisor of Marvel's What If last week. So Stephan is a guy who knows his way around sequential art storytelling. And the comic book, it's a vampire story, but it focuses around a team of human thieves who in the 1930s are going on the biggest heist of their careers. And what are they trying to steal? A fortune in silver bars. Where are they trying to steal it from? Dracula's castle. So this is a fabulous story. It's illustrated in beautiful black and white. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it ties in with our subject today because, as you can probably tell from the title, the entire story revolves around a particular vampire weakness. So it's an excellent use case in how vampire weaknesses can run an entire story. So that is my recommendation. You can get it from comic book stores, you can get it from your favorite online retailer, or you can just go to Dark Planet and order it there. It's creator owned, so all the proceeds go directly back to Stephan. We'll actually be interviewing Stephan here in just a little while to talk to him all about Silver, but in the meantime, it is well worth your vampire dollars. I just wanted to say a special thank you to my friend Doug Lefler for this amazing piece of vampire artwork that he did just to promote this YouTube channel, which was extremely generous of him. Doug is somebody who has worked in Hollywood for 1,000 years and, was the second unit director on Evil Dead and directed, all kinds of episodes of Hercules and Xena, and has directed his own movies, including The Last Legion with Colin Firth, if you may have seen that. Doug is a co-worker of mine. He's the head of story for The Third Floor, which is the place where I work. But he's also an incredible illustrator and an incredible storyteller, and he rarely does vampires, which is why this is so exciting. So I printed this up and put it on my wall because, hey, custom vampire artwork, absolutely, that's going up back here. If you want to check out Doug's work, he is extremely prolific, and you can find him on Facebook. You can find him at Scroll On, which is his sort of little comic book company. You can find him at Story Attic, which is a storytelling venture that he's heading up. And you'll find all kinds of great stories about dinosaurs and robots and fairies and dragons and and romance. All of his stuff is about young people falling in love with one another and heroic feats of daring. So definitely check out Doug's stuff. And thank you, Doug, for the artwork. It's fabulous. Thank you very much. Happy hunting.